Our next presenter is Matt Court. Mr. Court is a registered professional geoscientist in the state of Texas. Matt has extensive experience in the source water assessment and protection, revised total coliform rule, and groundwater rule programs. Matt received his Bachelor of Science in Geological Sciences from the University of Texas at Austin in 1998. Following graduation, Matt began his career at the TCEQ and is currently a member of the Drinking Water Assessment Team of the Drinking Water Standards Section. Please welcome Matt Court.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for being here. It's always nice to see everybody every year this time of year. So yeah, thanks again for coming. Every year we do basically a presentation for each of our main programs, and mine has been the groundwater rule since 2009 when the rule started. There's been no changes or anything, but we just like to highlight some of the bigger sampling programs and drinking water things that we do, just to either give you a refresher if you've seen this presentation or a form of this presentation, or you're already familiar with the groundwater rule. It serves as a refresher. If you're new, just getting started, it's a really good foundation to give you an idea of everything that's involved with the groundwater rule. As far as a basic outline, we're going to cover triggered and assessment source monitoring. That's the two raw sampling programs for the groundwater rule. We're going to talk about trigger source monitoring plans, which I just covered in a workshop and ran over here straight from the workshop. We talked about trigger source monitoring plans, and I don't know if anybody followed me up here, but we had some really good questions and a good discussion going there. And we'll talk about periodic sanitary surveys. That's part of the groundwater rule. And then corrective action, and also four-log treatment, which requires a concentration time study. And then we'll go into kind of compliance issues, public notification, things like that. So groundwater rule, it's a risk targeting approach, which basically means that we're just looking for wells that have issues with being susceptible to fecal contamination. Wells that have issues with getting E. coli positives, things like that. The rule is kind of designed to identify those sources and then apply some type of corrective action to those sources. This is a flow chart that I use in a lot of my presentations, and I just like it because it shows kind of the whole program on one page here, and you can see everything, starting on the left, the trigger source water monitoring, and then assessment source water monitoring and sanitary survey all can lead to corrective action if you have any issues with those. On the right side, well, first in the middle where it says option 1, that is one of the options that you can use to try to reduce the amount of raw samples that you have to collect in a triggered event, or mainly when you have a triggered event, which is a distribution positive that requires raw sampling at your wells. We're going to talk in depth about that coming up. And then another option, but could also be corrective action, is four-log treatment. Some of the larger systems that have multiple wells and kind of routinely collect positives, they want to do an extra, a little more stringent treatment process to be able to be exempt from all their well sampling. So that's four-log treatment. And if you're not familiar with that, we're gonna talk about it a little more in depth coming up. But basically, it's taking your disinfection with free chlorine and holding it in a storage tank before it goes out to distribution to increase the contact time with that disinfectant. So if that's mainly designed for wells, like I said, that just have a kind of almost a regular E. coli event. It's a lot of wells that are in the karstic environment, like here around central Texas with the Edwards Aquifer. The Edwards and those karstic aquifers allow just quick transport into the aquifers. So in some cases, if there's any kind of, E. coli or bacteria sources nearby that can get down in that well, we don't want to shut the well down, but we want to at least treat for it, going forward. So that's what 4-log treatment can do. On the, I got a little title slide every time we transition to a new topic, and you can kind of keep up with the, in the bottom right corner, the yellow highlighted is the area that we're going to be when you see that outline. So it kind of gives you a little heads up of where we are and how many more topics we have. But starting with raw well source monitoring and the microbial reporting form, let's just start at the beginning because that's where some of the more straightforward issues can arise if the sample form's not filled out properly. Starting out with raw source monitoring, you should have a sampling procedure, SOP, that, is in conjunction with your revised total coliform rule sampling. So, you probably all developed those and included raw sampling at some point since the rule started in 2009. But we've also got the sample siting plan. That's with RTCR. I'm sure you know all about that, but it basically lists all your sample sites and all your well sample locations. And then we get down into raw sampling, which is for the groundwater rule, it's triggered source monitoring or TSM, and then assessment source monitoring, which is ASM. The triggered source monitoring is a one-time event based on your routine distribution positive, and then the assessment source monitoring is a monthly sampling that's required usually after you get a rule exception. It's a condition of those rule exceptions. And then the raw well source monitoring, I just wanted to mention it should be done at the wellhead. There should be a sample tap on your wellhead. I have seen though several times where, through the years that sometimes wells don't have a sample tap on them. So the groundwater rule requires it to be sampled at the wellhead, and we also have a subchapter D rule that requires a sample tap at the well. So in the situations that I've seen it, it's always led to the system getting a plumber to come out and install that sample tap on the wellhead. So, in the end, it improved things along the way to where they could sample at that well much more easily. So with well sampling, basically raw equals pre-chlorination or pre-disinfectant, right? I mean, it's got to be raw water straight out of the ground. Sometimes when we disinfect wells, if they're not flushed out good enough, then you could have a little residual there, and we'll talk about that, on the lab form coming up. But basically, even though it's raw, and we all know it should be raw with no disinfectant, we still have to, in the field, record and measure and record that residual just to prove that it's a raw sample. Sometimes we get the forms in, and that disinfectant field is blank, and that's going to be a rejected sample because you have to prove that it's a raw sample. I've seen a lot of times where a raw sample will have a slight residual to it. So if that ever happens, you're out there sampling and you get a slight residual on your raw, just go ahead and keep flushing a little bit more until you can get it down to 0. Here's an example of the microbial reporting form. This is going through some updates right now, but this is just in as an example, just to kind of give you an idea of what we're looking for. The top left portion is all your basic system information. Then you get into the bottom where under sample location, you need to list the TCEQ source code for the well. Basically, it's the facility ID for that well, which starts with a G for groundwater, and then it's followed by your PWS ID, and then a unique letter like A, B, C, things like that. So we want to see that source code there, and then we want to see it marked raw well, and then the residual, go ahead and measure and make sure that's 0, and then record the 0. And then if it's a triggered event, say you got a routine distribution positive, we need to see the originating sample ID where that positive, so we can link that raw well sample to the positive, and we know which one it's linked to, and to make sure it's sampled within the appropriate time frame. So I wanted to start here. I mean, this is kind of where it all begins. If you get tripped up here, then you might get a little frustrated, but just wanted to point out a few of the high points here. So assessment source monitoring, like I said, is it's really designed for, say we have may have some suspicion about a well, maybe they got an E. coli positive in the past, or maybe their construction is substandard as far as public standards go. It's an irrigation well that's being developed into a public well. These are situations where we might want to take a monthly raw sample just to develop a sampling history on the well and make sure that well is okay to use. Like I said, it's most of the time this ASM is based on a rule exception. Say you can't get a sanitary control easement secured, or you have some issue with the setback distance, livestock within the setback, or things like that. We don't want to just say, no, you can't use that well, but we'll have to get an exception to that rule, and then as a condition of that exception, do the monthly raw sampling. It's kind of a trade-off for you to use a well that couldn't meet all the standards, but you then have this monthly sampling for the well. And like I said earlier, this monthly sampling is kind of designed for a well that we might think could be susceptible to fecal contamination. In trigger source monitoring, we'll go into this. This is found in 109 as well, 290-109. This one is based on your distribution sampling. So you get a distribution positive. In the past with the old total coliform rule, it was just collect 3 repeats. And with the revised total coliform rule, it's the same. You collect your 3 repeats, but the groundwater rule came along in 2009 and said, we want to also look at that source water. We want to see if because a lot of times, you get a positive out in distribution. It could be some kind of distribution issue with a broken line or something out there that's causing it. But sometimes we don't find anything, and so the groundwater came along and said, okay, we need to go back and look at the source. We need to look at the quality of the source water. So kind of brought that into the mix, and now we're trigger source monitoring is the part of the rule that deals with that. And so if we want to try to find a correlation between distribution positive and your raw well source. So it applies to any groundwater sources or any source or systems that use groundwater that's not treating that groundwater to 4 log standards. There are some systems that are mixed surface water and groundwater, and there's a few out there that will actually route their groundwater through their surface water plant. In that case, that would exempt them from the groundwater rule because it's getting that extra treatment through surface water treatment. But a lot of times those are treated separately, and the groundwater is injected and just sent out to distribution, whereas the surface water will come in and go through the plant. But so anyway, it applies to any system that uses groundwater that's not getting treated to 4 log standards. And it also applies to when you get that distribution positive. It's basically a 24-hour turnaround to go collect a round of well sampling for each positive. That leads us into this slide. This is kind of one of my disclaimer slides that I like to put out there because it's kind of one of the most common ways to get tripped up. The trigger source monitoring is a 1-to-1 relationship between the distribution positive and your required raw samples. So if you collect 5 positives out in distribution on one day or throughout the month, we're going to be looking for 5 samples from each well. And it gets, maybe a little counterintuitive when you get all the positives in one day. You do your repeat sampling, and then it's like you go out and collect a sample from each well and, make 1 round of well sampling. You're like, hey, I went to each well and sampled them. Well, we're looking for 5 from each well, so you're going to have to go each well and collect 5 samples. It's really only comes into play or creates confusion when those are done on the same day, like if all the positives are on the same day. If you get a positive early in the month, you do your repeat sampling and you do your raw sample, and then a couple weeks go by and you get another positive, you do the same thing again, right? You got to go through all the same procedures. So if they're the same day, it just means you still have to do that, but it's just all, in the same day. So I just like to highlight that here because it has created some frustrations out in the regulated community. So I just want to make sure everybody's clear on this one-to-one relationship. It also applies to, consecutive systems. If you provide groundwater to another system, or you obtain groundwater from a system, you're going to have to say you get a positive in your distribution, but you purchase groundwater from somebody. You have to tell that system within 24 hours that they need to go sample their wells, or that you had a distribution positive. Then that system has to go sample their wells, because that's where your groundwater's coming from. We like to work all the way up that consecutive system chain until we get to the wells, and then whoever has control of the wells is the one that ultimately has to sample those wells. It sounds confusing, but it's fairly, it doesn't happen that much, and it basically just says that, you have to go up the chain until you get to the system that has the wells. There are a couple of exceptions. Say you get a distribution positive out from a revised total coliform rule sampling, and you felt like that wasn't representative of your distribution system. You went through the invalidation process and were granted the invalidation. Well, that positive goes away, so that also eliminates the raw well sampling requirement. There's also, in rare situations where you could have a positive in distribution and that it was attributed to some construction activity or a line break or something that's right by the sample site, you could give us a call and say, hey, I think we have a distribution deficiency here. I don't think this positive was representative. So if that's the case, we'll evaluate it and decide if that, it's kind of like an invalidation, but it's a little different. But basically, these are the only two ways that you could get out of that trigger source monitoring other than the 4-log treatment. And these are fairly rare. I don't know if y'all dealt with these processes, but there's not a huge rate of granting these types of situations, but it is in the rule, and it's available if you ever have any questions about it. So moving along here, trigger source monitoring plans. This is a way to develop a monitoring plan for your system that's kind of common sense sampling. It's really geared towards systems with multiple pressure planes or isolated distribution areas, situations where wells may serve only a certain area, and it's only serving that area. We can develop this simple trigger source monitoring plan that says these wells serve these distribution sites and these wells serve these distribution sites, and if I get a distribution positive over here, I'm only going to sample these wells. If I get one over here, I'm only sampling these. Otherwise, if you don't have this plan, you're going to have to sample all your wells within 24 hours. So this is a tool to be able to use that kind of allows you to set up a more intelligent sampling process. And here at it's not recommended for single well systems, because if you got one well, there's no need to identify any of this. Now, there are basically two options and kind of a third that's a combination of the two options. Option one here is setting up a plan that is dealing with wells that represent coliform monitoring locations. So in other words, usually it's like pressure planes, things like that. And again, this is the trigger source monitoring plans. A lot of the systems that have done it are systems that have a lot of wells and have to take a lot of revised total coliform rule samples each month, so there's a good chance they're going to get positives. It's a way for those types of systems to not have to go do 100 well samples in 24 hours. But with that being said, I've had smaller systems that just had a few wells, but they wanted to show that these wells only serve certain areas, and I only want to do this well sample if something occurs at that site. I've got a couple of real simple examples here. So this is a case that's got a north pressure plane and a south pressure plane with a valve in between, 3 wells on each plane, and you can see there's 5 sample points on each plane. So if you get a positive up in the north plane where that red cross is, and you have this triggered source monitoring plan, you're only going to have to do 3 well samples instead of 6, basically. And This one can be frustrating for systems because the way the rule is written, if you don't have this plan, you're going to have to do all 6 of those samples. But you could be sitting there looking at me going, yeah, but that's in this pressure plane. There's no way that water is going down to the south plane. But the way it's written, if you don't have this plan, you'd have to do all 6 versus 3 if you've got this trigger source plan. So just to kind of summarize the option 1 here, multiple pressure planes, physically separate areas. And you can use hydraulic modeling. We've had a couple of systems that have done that. It basically, when it gets complicated out there, like it often does, you can use a model and dye testing and stuff like that kind of proves where your water's going. And to do these plans, you do not need a licensed engineer. They're fairly straightforward. I mean, they can be complex, but I'm always here to help. I can walk you through whatever option you want to do. Moving on to option 2 here. These are situations where you've got multiple well fields, or say you even have just one well field, and you say you got 10 wells at that well field, and they're all drilled to a similar depth into the same aquifer. All the well construction's pretty similar. You could name one well to sample in a triggered source event instead of having to sample all 10 of them. So it's a way we can outline or identify wells that represent other wells. So this is an example, again, another real simple example here. 3 different well fields, 3 wells each, and the purple has been identified as a representative well for each of the well fields. So if you get a positive up here where it says, where the red cross is, if you don't have the plan, you're looking at 9 well samples to collect. If you have this set up like this with a representative well, then it reduces it down to 3. So it can save, a lot of time there. And we can also combine the 2. This is a combination of the 2 options where you've got the 2 different pressure planes and you've got 2 different well fields. And without the triggered source plan, you get a positive up in that north plane. Without the plan, you're looking at 6 samples, but with the representative well being the purple well for that well field in the north, and also saying that there's no way that well water is going to the south plane, you've reduced, from 6 down to 1. Again, like I said, it kind of allows you, you can utilize this to set up more common sense approach to your raw sampling. All right, moving on to the next section, we've got CCIs, as we call them here, comprehensive compliance investigations. These are already required, through the agency every 3 years for community systems and every 5 years for non-community systems. But the groundwater rule, when it came along, it said, okay, we want to kind of piggyback onto that, and we want to look at the 8 elements of sanitary survey with regards to the groundwater rule. So these are 8 areas that could lead to allowing contamination into the distribution system. And during your CCI, your inspection, if you have any issues with any of these areas, there are certain rule citations in each of these 8 elements that are linked back to the groundwater rule. So if you have a problem with your source, say it's a source that hasn't been approved for use or something like that, that could be identified as a significant deficiency under the groundwater rule, which would require corrective action. So this is a way to kind of go beyond the well source water quality and kind of look at the whole system again and how it relates to groundwater contamination. So as you remember that first flow chart, everything kind of flows to corrective action. So I wanted to hit on that a little bit. So E. coli positives will require corrective action, or if you get a significant deficiency in your during those inspections. That's the 2 big areas. If that happens, there are a possible 6 corrective actions. These are all in Chapter 290-116. There's 6 of them here. And, basically we'll be if say you get an E. coli positive in your well, we're going to be talking to you immediately, and we'll kind of start thinking about what, a corrective action would be appropriate. If it's a first time it's ever happened, we're probably just going to go, okay, shut the well off, disinfect the well, and let's see how that goes and just move on, But if it gets into more of a regular thing where, you're looking at monthly E. coli positives, things like that, then we're probably going to drop down into like number 4, the 4-log treatment. That's kind of the best tool we have for a well that is susceptible to fecal contamination. We just go ahead and treat the water for the E. coli. That way you can still keep using the well, but we're treating for that contaminant. Some of these others will provide an alternate source of water. That could, just be while you're disinfecting the well. Let's shut the well off, use a different well that hasn't had a positive, or I've even had some single well systems that had to shut the well off, disinfect it, and then provide bottled water during that time. So it can get a little dicey, but the main thing is to address that E. coli right away and try to get that well disinfected. You can eliminate the source of contamination. Say you got a septic field that's nearby that's you think is contributing to it. If you feel pretty strongly about that, or even have proof that is where the contamination is coming from, remove those septic systems, things like that. And then we get into 4-log treatment, well disinfection, or we could also utilize monthly well sampling. If it's, say you've had a couple of E. coli's in a year or two, it's kind of enough to get our attention, but it's not enough to go straight to 4-log treatment. We might want to just start doing monthly raw sampling and just see where we're at on a monthly basis. And, some of these could be difficult, like I don't think I've worked with a system on eliminating a source of contamination yet. That's kind of very tricky. It can be very tough to be able to do that, but I've read stories of other states and things like that have dealt with removing, say, septic systems or something like that. So it could lead to something like that, and you get rid of the contaminant source, and you don't have to do this 4-log treatment regularly. But with all that being said, probably our best tool for a well that's susceptible to fecal contamination is the 4-log treatment. And that brings us to the 4-log section. So I want to just hit on that a little bit here. Basically, 4-log treatment is free chlorine disinfection, but it has to sit in a storage tank for a specified amount of time before it goes out into distribution. That contact time with the disinfectant will increase the inactivation rate up to 99.99%. So that's very effective against E. coli and viruses, things like that. I'd say free chlorine. There are other ways to get 4-log. You can, use some of these other disinfectants. But those situations, especially chloramines, that's going to require a huge amount of storage capacity to be able to get 4-log credit. There's one example of a system that they got their water from like 62 miles away, and so we were able to work with them on the CT study that 62-mile pipe was before the entry point, so we gave them credit for all that storage capacity, which allowed them to use chloramines to get 4-log treatment, which is very rare. But the point being, there's a lot of unique situations out there. So, if you have any questions or ways you want to try to utilize 4-log treatment, just let me know and we can try to work through it. So that being said, in some situations, a system can get 4-log treatment credit, and they have, say, a really huge storage tank. That huge storage capacity and you're using free chlorine, that could make your minimum residual requirement really low. You could be like way under what's required for the disinfectant level quarterly operating report. Out in distribution, free chlorine is 0.2, chloramine is 0.5, so you could do your CT study and it could come out and say, hey, you just have to have 0.02 in that tank and you got 4-log treatment. But if that's the case, you just have to know before the water enters the distribution, you have to boost it. You got to have a booster outside of that tank to get it up to the 0.2. Otherwise, you're going to have compliance issues with that DLQOR requirement. And again, 4-log treatment is it's not required of all systems. It's either an option for you to have a little easier way to deal with the rule, in other words, being exempt from all the well sampling, or in some cases, if you've got E. coli issues, we may require it as a corrective action. So just wanted to point that out that, it's not required for everybody. When this rule first started in '09, we were doing this conference, and it got out in kind of as a rumor that everybody was going to have to go to 4-log treatment, and it was kind of, I remember a couple of panicky people coming up to me worried about having to do 4-log treatment, and I was like, no, it's just an option. So unless it's a corrective action, but we're going to talk a little bit more about that here. We've kind of covered most of this, but why would you do 4-log? It exempts you from the trigger source monitoring after distribution positive. So you get a positive out in distribution, you got 100 wells, you got to sample all those wells within 24 hours. That could be a huge burden. So 4-log would exempt you from that requirement. That's basically the main reasons for it, exempting you from the extra sampling, or is it, like I said, it could be a corrective action for E. coli issues. Now, as far as the requirements, based on population, you're going to have to monitor either daily or continuously the disinfectant residuals. So this is the big catch on, with the smaller groundwater systems, just having the personnel to go out there and do that daily is a burden, and, could be an issue. We've had some small systems that, didn't have the staff to do it every day, but decided to hook up like a CL17 analyzer so they could remotely monitor the disinfectant. So, it's a lot higher cost at the beginning, but it could allow you to, maintain the same staff and still be able to comply with the 4-log requirements. So how to apply for 4-log treatment? Basically, you're going to have a cover letter. We've got a groundwater minimum specified residual template, which is just a single page, and it's fairly straightforward. And then basically a diagram or schematic of your plant and system. This is the groundwater rule template here. It's just like all you would have to do is the yellow fields, which is, total capacity of all your tanks. Then you got the minimum, maximum water levels, and then you've got your service pump capacity. So once you plug those numbers in, it's going to run some, a formula which will spit out your minimum specified residual, which is your disinfectant requirement. And that's what I was talking about. Sometimes you could do this form and it could say 0.02, and I'm like, man, that's really low. But just know that you got to, still comply with the distribution requirements of 0.2 and 0.5. But yeah, for groundwater, it's compared to surface water, it's pretty straightforward. You don't have to have a licensed engineer, any of that. So this is the CT studies are reviewed by our one of our other teams in the division. It's the corrosion control team, but they have 4-log treatment. It used to be the technical review and oversight team, and those two teams, there's a new team now, this corrosion control team. They kind of work with each other, but that your CT study would go to that other team. They would basically review your plant information, your CT study, and send you an approval or denial letter. Sometimes they send you a letter that says, we can't approve it at this time, but if you make these adjustments, then we'll be able to approve it. But you have to get that official approval letter before you're on the books for 4-log treatment. And this is the threshold for the compliance monitoring. Basically, the cutoff is 3,300. So below 3,300 is just a daily grab sample. If you're above 3,300, it's going to be continuous monitoring. And if you ever, say you opted in and say, okay, I want to do 4-log treatment instead of triggered source monitoring, but once you get into it, it's like, okay, this extra staff time and the different, chemical, whatever you need to do becomes a burden. And you're like, well, I'm not even getting any positives, so why am I doing this extra treatment? You can get out of it. If you opted in, you can opt out, but you just have to put that in writing for us. As far as compliance, we're getting into this last section. Treatment technique violations. if you get a significant deficiency identified in one of your inspections and you don't complete the corrective action within 120 days or within agreed upon schedule, then that could be a treatment technique violation, or if you're not maintaining your 4-log treatment. The 24-hour public notice is required after an E. coli positive. Keep in mind that an E. coli positive on a well it's not a violation, but it still requires the 24-hour public notice. It's considered a acute situation, so it's not a violation, but it does require that 24-hour notice. If you ever get an E. coli positive on a well, we will be in immediate contact with you to go over all the procedures and what you need to do. And this includes results from, trigger source monitoring and assessment source monitoring. 30-day public notice. This is basically, the treatment technique situations. So you got an E. coli positive and you didn't do the corrective action, or you didn't do corrective action after a significant deficiency, or you didn't maintain the 4-log treatment. And the 12-month PN is required for basically all the monitoring issues. So say you have a trigger source event, you just spaced out and you didn't do the raw sampling, that would be the 12-month public notice, Tier 3 public notice requirement. You didn't do your monthly assessment source monitoring, or say you've implemented 4-log treatment, but you forgot to do the daily monitoring on the disinfectant, that would also fall into this 12-month Tier 3 situation. The CCR is required for community systems. This is the 3 areas, basically: uncorrected significant deficiencies, corrected significant deficiencies. So say you have a situation that requires corrective action on a significant deficiency. Once you take care of that and get it corrected, you're supposed to post in your CCR that has been corrected. And then E. coli positives have to go in there as well. Oh, this is a big one. So I talked about this in the workshop too, and if you have any questions on it or need the form, just send me an email or phone call. We do have a form that can document wells that are offline. So best example is if you're trigger source event, you get a positive distribution. Say you have 5 wells, but only 2 of them are running. Just give us a heads up, and we won't schedule those that were offline. But just a simple form to fill out. I can get you that form, and that's how we document to kind of. And we'd like that information up front, if possible. If you can, let us know up front. That way, we can set up the schedule from the beginning the way it needs to be, and prevents any kind of erroneous violations from going out. FMT, I'm sure y'all have heard about FMT at some point with the presentation. This is where we have staff from all areas of the things that we do that we can go out and assist you, there on the ground at your system and help you out and get you started on things. So don't forget about FMT. Here's my contact information. Really probably the best communication is that GWR data, because it goes to myself, Ken Quinney, he's my partner for Groundwater Rule, and also Claire Carlton, our team leader. It goes to all 3 of us simultaneously, so somebody's going to be seeing it, right away. But my direct email's there, my direct phone number's there. If you want to call, have any one-on-one issues you want to talk about, just let me know.
We have a few questions from the virtual audience. We actually have about 6. So I'll go really quickly. If we get an E. coli hit, you will contact us directly?
Yes. We usually go for get the information off of the sample form, and we're immediately in contact. We've got a list of contacts for each system as well. So, yeah, once we get that E. coli positive, we're immediately contacting you with guidance and what you need to be doing. So.
Okay, great. If I purchase some of my water from another system and my system has a positive, what are the steps? Does the water system I purchase from need to test their wells?
Yes, so you would basically, instead of having 24 hours to sample the wells, you would then have 24 hours to notify that other system, and let them know that they need to sample the wells. They should be informed about it, but, it's not the most common thing that happens, so it's best to just give that system a call that you're purchasing the water from and let them know, hey, I got a positive out in distribution. You need to go do the well sampling. And, you know, if any questions arise when that happens, they can be directed to me, you know, anytime.
Okay, does 4-log treatment require any mixing?
No, 4-log treatment, just in a nutshell, is basically free chlorine disinfection into a storage tank, and then you collect the residual after the storage tank, and then it goes to distribution. So it's basically just a storage tank sitting there, and you know, the contact time in the tank is what's getting you the extra inactivation rate.
Okay, thank you. What kind of water quality similarities is TCEQ looking for at a well to be considered a representative well?
That's a good question. We're looking for wells that are within a fairly close proximity. You know, like I mentioned, the well fields, they're usually, you know, within the hundreds of feet, you know, in proximity to each other. So we're looking for wells drilled to the same aquifer, similar depth and similar construction, but the water chemistry can show us that, okay, you know, there's certain values that are very similar between each of those wells. That way we can say, okay, it's apparent that you're in the same aquifer based on these geochemistry results that we're seeing. You know, if we say there's a, you know, some kind of parameter that's in that sample that is way different than the other well, then that's going to be something we'd look at that go, okay, maybe these aren't representative of each other. Maybe they are in different aquifers, because different aquifers have different characteristics and chemical characteristics.
Okay, thank you. 5 wells feeding into one line that goes to AGST, and you get a positive in the distribution system. Do you have to take 5 samples from all 5 wells?
So yeah, if you have 5 wells and they are, you know, you don't have a trigger source monitoring plan, then yes, that would require all 5 wells if they were running. If any of the wells were not in use at that time, then they could document that on an inactive well form. But otherwise, yeah, if they're all running and serving that area, then they would have to sample all 5.
Okay, under what policy or rules do I find out if the groundwater rule applies to my site?
The groundwater rule is in subchapter F, 290-109. That's where the main groundwater rule is. But they could also contact me just to make sure we're on the same page, you know, with what they're asking. But yeah, the rule is found in 290-109, the main sampling part of it.
We have a few more questions over here.
Okay.
Okay, so triggered source monitoring is distribution total coliform positive. It does not have to be E. coli, right?
Right, right.
And then also on assessment source monitoring, if any of the compliance rules kick in at E. coli positive, what happens if you get total coliform positive on assessment source monitoring?
Oh, on your raw well sample?
Yes, sir.
If you get a total, that's a good question. We had that question over too. This is, I mean, it's kind of counterintuitive, because you think positive, you think repeats, right? I mean, you think some kind of action is required, but the groundwater rule is only interested in E. coli for the raw well sampling. So say if you do your monthly ASM sample on your raw well and it's TC positive, there's no rule-based action for that. You know, you would get credit for collecting the sample, but, you know, since it's total coliform and not E. coli, the groundwater rule would not require any corrective action or anything. And there's no repeat sampling for a raw positive in that situation either. If a system gets if you get an E. coli raw sample, we like to take the approach to go straight to corrective action, because, you know, the chances of a false positive on an E. coli is fairly rare, and E. coli is an acute health risk, so we like to go straight to well disinfection first. You know, just that's the quickest thing we can do to address it. It is in the rule that after an E. coli raw positive, we could require 5 additional raw samples from that well, and then we can evaluate those raw samples. But our thinking is, if you get 1 E. coli positive, we need to address that. I mean, we don't need to waste time with extra sampling, extra analysis in the lab, things like that when you have potentially E. coli running through the system. We like to go straight to disinfection and take care of it that way. And, but yeah, great question. If it's a raw, total coliform positive, there's no rule-based action.
One question. If you're blending surface water and groundwater together in a common tank before it goes to distribution, does the groundwater rule still apply?
If the groundwater was treated so that's a really good question. That's come up before, but if the groundwater is treated to the surface water standards and then mixes, like say the groundwater gets fed into that surface water plant operation, and then they're sitting mixed, in a storage tank after that, then the groundwater rule would not apply. Now, if they are independently treated and then they end up in a storage tank mixed, if that groundwater just went through basic disinfection and then gets into the tank mixing, then the groundwater rule is still going to apply. So the treatment, whether or not it went through the additional treatment, is the key. But yeah, really good question.
Thank you,
All
Speaker.
right. Thank y'all so much. Appreciate it.